Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So today I want to talk about a single American town that contains a long and dark history of slavery and racism. I'm talking about Old Town Alexandria in Virginia. Now, if you go to Old Town Alexandria today and you walk down Duke Street or King Street, you'll find a beautiful, quaint little town full of shops, restaurants, and hotels. It's a really popular spot for tourists, and I've been there many times myself. Now, if you walk down Duke Street, you might come across a large brick building, and at first glance, it looks like any other building, nothing out of the ordinary. But if you look closer, you'll see that it's the Freedom House Museum that explores the history of slavery in Virginia. However, from the 1820s to the 1860s, that same building was the largest slave trading house in the country. It was in this building where thousands of enslaved black people were sold out the front door like commodities to be worked to death on slave labor camps in the Deep South. In this photograph, you can see the sign on the building, Price, Birch & Co., Dealers in Slaves. The men who started this business, Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, became multi-millionaires by selling enslaved black people before selling it to another slave trading business in the 1850s. These men got rich off of selling black bodies and dealing in black suffering and pain. And it's hard to imagine the horrors that went on inside this building and others like it, where people were turned into property. In these buildings, white plantation owners inspected enslaved people like they would cattle. They put their hands in these people's mouths to examine their teeth and make sure they were healthy and ready to work. They stripped these people naked to examine their bodies to make sure that they were getting their money's worth. Families were torn apart as mothers were sold separately from their children and husbands were sold separately from their wives. Infants were ripped out of their mother's arms and sold to white enslavers who might give them to their children as gifts. The human traffickers would have been immune to the constant screaming and crying that shook these buildings' walls, whereas these sounds would have caused a mental breakdown in anyone with a heart or a soul. This history of slavery, torture, and violence is not confined to this building, it's all around us in Virginia. Here's a drawing of a slave auction in Richmond, Virginia, another popular spot for selling human beings. Here's a photograph of a slave auction block that used to be on a public street in Fredericksburg, Virginia. It was on this stone where black people were advertised for sale and sold off to the highest bidder. For a long time, this slave auction block was just sitting there, a curious relic from a not-so-distant past. However, a few years ago, during a Black Lives Matter protest, the auction block was finally removed and placed in a museum. Now, it's important to remember that these people that were sold on auction blocks and kept in department stores like inventory were not just slaves. They were individuals, and their potential to be anything was stolen from them. This was the message of one school teacher who put this on her classroom door. Dear students, they didn't steal slaves, they stole scientists, doctors, architects, teachers, entrepreneurs, astronomers, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, etc., and made them slaves. Sincerely, your ancestors. The people who were bought in Alexandria and considered white property were denied their dignity and their humanity. Instead of getting to live their lives on their own terms, they were forced to perform brutal labor for white profit. And this was an extremely profitable business. An enslaved adult male could be sold for anywhere from $500 to $1,600, and they could pick up to $54,000 of cotton a year. This was the fate of a black man named Thomas Fuller, who was sold into slavery in Alexandria, Virginia. During his lifetime, everyone around him realized he was brilliant and could have achieved so much more if it were not for slavery. In his obituary, we learn that Thomas Fuller died in 1790 at 80 years old. He was the property of Mrs. Elizabeth Cox of Alexandria. He was brought to this country at the age of 14 and sold as a slave. He became known as the famous African calculator. This man was a prodigy. Though he could never read or write, he had perfectly acquired the art of mathematics. He could multiply 7 into itself, that product by 7, and the product so produced by 7 for 7 times. He could give the number of months, days, weeks, hours, minutes, and seconds in any period of time that a person chose to mention, allowing in his calculation for all the leap years that happened in the time. He would give the number of poles, yards, feet, inches, in any distance, say the diameter of the Earth's orbit, And in every calculation, he would produce the true answer in less time than 99 men out of 100 would produce with their pens. He drew just conclusions from facts, surprisingly so for his opportunities. Had Thomas Fuller's opportunity been equal to those of thousands of his fellow men, even an Isaac Newton himself need not have been ashamed to acknowledge him a brother in science. Now, we all know the name of Isaac Newton, but how many of us know the name of Thomas Fuller? How many more Thomas Fullers were there that were deprived of a real life? Now, it's important to note that even if Thomas Fuller had been born after slavery, there's no guarantee that he would have lived a long, happy life. Because for over 100 years after slavery ended, black Americans were terrorized by their white neighbors who felt that they had the right to deprive them of their life at any time for any reason. Even after slavery was abolished in 1865, black people in Alexandria were not free from racism, torture, or violence. In fact, 34 years after slavery ended, a lynching took place in Alexandria on King Street within walking distance of that same building where enslaved black people were bought and sold. In August 1899, a black teenager named Benjamin Thomas was lynched in Alexandria, Virginia, after he was accused of assaulting a white girl. As in so many other cases, Thomas never saw a courtroom, never saw a jury, a judge, or a trial. He was killed simply based on an accusation. Now, I want to tell you the story of Benjamin Thomas, and I'm going to be reading from contemporary newspaper accounts that recorded this brutal public killing. When Thomas was arrested and placed in jail, a lynch mob began forming outside its doors at 11 a.m. When its numbers had reached over 1,000, Alexandria's mayor, George L. Simpson, tried to disperse the crowd by telling them that a fair trial would be held that day, and he promised them that if this is not done, I will give you my word as a man of honor that I will personally lead a mob tomorrow to lynch Thomas. His words had no effect, and the mob surged into the jail using axes, bars, rams, and every available weapon to break down the iron doors. The mob leaders eventually found a scared Thomas hiding in the jail cellar and dragged him out into the streets to loud cheers. A noose was quickly thrown over his head, and he was dragged for 6 or 7 blocks down King Street and from King Street down to Fairfax Street. One paper reported that Thomas's cries and moans were heartrending, but the mob was relentless. Down to King Street, the crowd proceeded, shouting and firing pistols into the air. Several people held onto the rope that was pulling Thomas down the street as he was chased by a screaming mob. And in the tussle, every bit of clothing was torn from his body with the exception of his shoes. His cries and moans were pitiful, but they were not heeded. His body was horribly maimed by the rough cobblestones. When they reached their destination, Thomas was quickly strung up to a lamppost before the howling mob. His body was perfectly nude as he hung there, writhing in the agonies of death. After 15 minutes of watching Thomas struggle and choke, someone shouted to the men to line up and the order was given to fire, and a dozen or more shots were fired at the dangling form. Several of these took effect in his body, but he continued to writhe unconsciously. It was 20 minutes before Thomas was finally cut down, still clinging to life, when the crowd rushed upon him, beating and kicking him. This procedure continued for a moment when a member of the mob stepped forward from the crowd and, placing his weapon to the breast of the Negro, fired a shot which ended his existence. After the lynching, several of the spectators, exhibiting an unnatural fury, then rushed to the spot, eagerly striving for relics of the death in the shape of bits of rope. The Washington Post reported that the mob that swung the Negro was for the most part an orderly one and comprised of many of the leading citizens. As many as 2,000 citizens of Alexandria watched Thomas be tortured and killed in the streets that day. Now, for decades, if you had gone to the spot where Benjamin Thomas was killed in 1899, you would have never known about this story. There was no memorial, no historical marker, nothing. However, thanks to the Equal Justice Initiative, there will now be a historical marker there telling the story of Benjamin Thomas. This is the importance of institutions like the Freedom House Museum and lynching memorials like these. We can't continue to hide this history any longer. In order to heal, we have to bring it into the light. I find it ironic that today there's a popular ghost tour of Old Town Alexandria where they show you the supposedly haunted buildings, but the real ghosts are the ones that haunt our history.